Welcome, dear listener. Take a moment to find your most comfortable place, whether it is a chair beside the quiet window, a sofa with the last traces of daylight falling across it, or your own bed prepared for a slow drift toward rest. Allow the air around you to soften. Allow your breath to settle. This is not a hurried story. It is one that moves in the way history itself moves, sometimes measured, sometimes still, yet always deep. Tonight, we begin a journey to a corner of the world that is both beautiful and heavy with memory. Our subject is the Hobart Penitentiary in Tasmania, Australia. At first, it may sound like a place defined only by confinement, by walls and silence. But as we walk through its story together, you will see it is also a lens into centuries of human endeavor, struggle, punishment, and reform. The penitentiary is not simply a prison. It is a vessel of Tasmania's colonial history, a record of architecture shaped by necessity, and a silent witness to the lives of thousands of men and women who once moved within its cold stone walls. In the early 19th century, Tasmania, then known as Van Diemen's Land, was one of the farthest outposts of the British Empire. Across thousands of miles of open sea, ships arrived carrying convicts, soldiers, free settlers, and supplies. Britain sought to use this island not only as a penal colony, but also as a foundation for expansion, an anchor of empire at the southern edge of the known world. It was here, in Hobart, that the penitentiary would rise. As you listen, let your imagination drift. Picture the southern skies above the Derwent River, vast and cool. Picture the smell of sea salt mixed with the distant smoke of wood fires, a town slowly growing around the harbour. And amid this young settlement, the penitentiary took form, stone by stone, hand by hand, built both by the labour of convicts and the designs of colonial authority. The story of the Hobart Penitentiary stretches across decades. It begins with the great tide of transportation, when tens of thousands of men and women were exiled from Britain and Ireland to Australia. It unfolds through the architecture of the prison chapel, the austere dormitories, and the long cells of solitary confinement. It is marked by events, trials, punishments, reforms, and the slow change of public attitudes toward crime and justice. And it continues into the present day, where the penitentiary survives not as a working prison, but as a heritage site, carefully preserved for those who wish to walk among its ruins and hear its echoes. In the hours ahead, we will move gently through these layers. We will not rush. Each chapter will take us deeper into the penitentiary's past, its geography, its role in Tasmania's society, and the people whose fates were bound to it. There will be knowledge, yes, dates, structures, events, but there will also be reflection, an attempt to see what this place reveals about the human experience of justice, punishment, and memory. As you let the words flow, notice how the pace is unhurried, like walking slowly along a stone corridor. You may hear in your imagination the sound of footsteps on flagstones, the murmur of voices long gone, the faint creak of wooden doors. This is the rhythm of our story. So, let us begin. Our journey into the history of the Hobart Penitentiary has just opened its gates. Ahead lies not only the tale of a prison, but the unfolding chronicle of Tasmania itself, a land shaped by beauty and by exile, by resilience and by stone walls. Let us drift back to the early years of the 19th century. The British Empire, stretched across oceans, was under constant pressure to manage its growing population, its economic demands, and its restless underclass. In Britain itself, poverty and crime often ran side by side. Petty theft, the stealing of a loaf of bread, or the picking of a pocket could result in harsh punishment. The prisons of London and the provincial cities were overcrowded, diseased, and unstable. Transportation, sending convicts across the seas, was not a new idea, but after the loss of the American colonies in the 1780s, Britain turned its gaze toward the distant continent of Australia. By 1803, a small British expedition landed in what is now Tasmania, then called Van Diemen's Land, after the Dutch explorer who charted its coast in the 17th century. The colony's first foothold was fragile, yet within only a few decades, Hobart grew from a rudimentary camp into a thriving, if often harsh, settlement. Convicts were central to this transformation. They built the docks, the roads, the churches and the houses. Their labor was the skeleton on which the colony's body grew. But where there are convicts, there must also be control. The system of transportation was not intended simply to exile. It was meant to discipline, to reform through hard labor, and for some, to break the spirit of disobedience. Thus, prisons were required. At first, these were makeshift, small holding cells, rudimentary stockades, or the use of military barracks. Yet as the colony expanded, the need for a more permanent, more controlled establishment became urgent. The Hobart Penitentiary rose to answer this need. It was not built in isolation, but as part of a growing network of penal institutions across Tasmania, Port Arthur, Sarah Island, Oatlands, each with its own grim reputation. Yet Hobart's penitentiary was distinct. It stood within the heart of the colonial capital itself, its high walls a daily reminder to free settlers, officials, and convicts alike that the machinery of justice was always present. Imagine Hobart at that time. The streets were unpaved, sometimes muddy, often noisy with the clatter of carts and the calls of traders. Along the waterfront, ships from Britain, from Sydney, and from whaling stations further south docked and unloaded their cargoes. Soldiers in scarlet coats patrolled, their presence as visible as the gallows that occasionally stood at the edge of the town. In this atmosphere, the penitentiary was not hidden away, but integrated into the living fabric of the city. The choice of location was practical. The building, originally conceived as a convict chapel, was constructed between 1830 and 1834 under the design of the colonial architect John Lee Archer. It was intended to seat over 1,000 prisoners, an extraordinary scale that reflects both the ambitions of the colonial authorities and the sheer numbers of convicts arriving in Van Diemen's Land. But like many structures of empire, its purpose evolved. The chapel soon incorporated courtrooms and cells, becoming not just a place of worship, but also a place of judgment and confinement. Consider the dual symbolism of that space. On Sundays, the same men who labored in chains during the week would be gathered to hear sermons on morality and redemption. On weekdays, those same walls would echo with the legal language of trials, verdicts, and punishments, justice and faith, authority and salvation, all woven together in stone. It is tempting to think of these convicts only as a faceless mass, a tide of criminals shipped across the world. But each had a story, some guilty of violence, others guilty of desperation, some hardened in their defiance, others broken in spirit. The penitentiary became the stage on which those stories intersected with the power of the empire. And yet, amid the severity, there was also a slow shaping of society. The penitentiary and the penal system provided the labor that built Hobart's Georgian facades, the sandstone warehouses by the docks, and the narrow lanes that today carry the charm of age. In this paradox, Hobart was both punished into existence and nurtured into permanence. As we stand in imagination before the penitentiary's stone walls, we sense more than the architecture. We sense the geography of justice in a far-flung colony, the way distance itself became a form of punishment. Thousands of miles from home, convicts could not escape the sea that enclosed them. The island, and within it, the penitentiary, was a layered prison, one of walls, one of ocean, one of time. Pause here for a moment. Let the picture settle. A young colony, a rising city, a chapel turned into a prison, and men and women whose lives were bound within its confines. This is the stage on which our story will continue. Close your eyes for a moment and picture sandstone, that soft, golden stone, quarried from the hills and riverbanks around Hobart, became the defining material of the colony's earliest buildings. Sunlight warms it to a pale honey. Rain darkens it to a muted grey. It is both fragile and enduring, an apt metaphor for the settlement itself. The Hobart Penitentiary was raised from this stone under the vision of John Lee Archer, who arrived in Van Diemen's Land in 1827 as the civil engineer and colonial architect. Archer's legacy across Tasmania is immense. Bridges, warehouses, military barracks, and civic buildings. His hand was steady, practical, and yet capable of subtle grandeur. In the penitentiary, he designed not merely a building, but an institution. At its heart lay a vast chapel, capable of seating more than 1,000 souls. Imagine that immense hall, tiered galleries, plain timber pews, and a pulpit elevated to command attention. The design was austere, without unnecessary ornamentation, yet its scale alone was meant to impress upon the convicts the weight of divine authority. But architecture is never neutral. Every arch, every stairwell, every door was designed to serve both faith and control. Convicts were segregated according to status and behavior. Some sat in the galleries, others in the body of the hall. Each group observed and divided. In the very act of worship, discipline was enforced. Even the sound of hymns, rising from 1,000 voices, carried a note of surveillance. By the 1850s, the building's purpose shifted further. Courtrooms were inserted into its eastern end. Judges sat where preachers once spoke. Wooden docks and benches were added, and juries deliberated within walls that had heard psalms only a generation earlier. The penitentiary thus became a hybrid space, half chapel, half courthouse. It embodied the union of spiritual authority and legal judgment, the colony's attempt to civilize as well as to punish. The cells beneath the chapel told another story still. These were narrow, dim spaces, designed not for congregation but for isolation. A man could be locked alone with nothing but his thoughts, the muffled sounds of life above him, and the cold stone pressing inward. Solitary confinement was regarded by some reformers as a path to repentance, but to many who endured it, it was a descent into despair. Stone corridors echoed with silence more profound than any sermon. Let us walk, in imagination, through those corridors. The walls are rough to the touch, cool even in the height of summer. The air smells faintly of lime dust and damp. A narrow slit of a window admits only a trickle of light, casting long shadows across the flagstone floor. When the heavy door closes, the world shrinks to a few square feet. In such spaces, time loses its rhythm. Days stretch endlessly, and the boundary between memory and dream begins to blur. Above ground, however, the penitentiary projected order. Its symmetrical facades, its measured geometry, its placement within the city spoke of control, of stability, of the authority of the colonial government. To the free citizens of Hobart, the penitentiary was a reminder of the law's presence. To the convicts, it was a daily confrontation with power rendered in stone. Architecture then was not simply about utility. It was a language. The chapel spoke of redemption, the courtrooms of justice, the cells of discipline, and the outer walls of authority. Together, they told a story of a society striving to impose order upon exile, morality upon crime, and permanence upon a young settlement at the edge of the known world. And yet, architecture also ages. As the decades passed, the sandstone weathered, timbers creaked, and the uses of the building changed. What was once sacred space became administrative. What was once a house of judgment became, in time, a relic. The very stones carry these layers like sediment, each one whispering of a different era. In walking through the penitentiary today, one senses this palimpsest of purpose. Visitors trace their hands along the same stone, once touched by convicts, chaplains, magistrates, and jailers. The building itself becomes a document, written not in ink, but on walls and doorways. It is an archive of sandstone and shadow. Pause with me here. Let the image settle. A vast chapel turned courthouse, cells beneath ground level, and facades that gaze steadily out upon a growing town. This architecture was never only about bricks and mortar. It was about authority, faith, and the shaping of human lives. Life within the penitentiary was marked by rhythm, not the gentle rhythm of seasons, nor the freedom of days chosen by one's own will, but the regimented cadence of bells, orders, and footsteps. At dawn, the convicts were stirred from their beds, if beds they could be called. Some slept on wooden planks, others on thin mattresses stuffed with straw. The early morning air was cool, often damp, the smell of stone and humanity mingling in a way that never quite dispersed. A guard's voice, sharp against the quiet, would rouse them. Chains clinked, boots scraped on flagstones. The day had begun. Breakfast was a sparse affair. A portion of bread, sometimes porridge, often little more than sustenance to fuel labor. Coffee was rare, tea a luxury. Water was the common drink. Rations were carefully measured, intended to keep bodies alive and working, but never to indulge. Hunger was a constant companion, pressing at the edges of thought. Then came the work. For many, this meant leaving the penitentiary walls to labor on roads, docks, or public works projects. The colony demanded infrastructure, and convict labor provided it. You can still see their handiwork in Hobart today. Stone bridges with arches as steady as the day they were laid. Warehouses whose sandstone blocks bear the marks of convict chisels. Roads that once carved their way through bushland. Others remained within the penitentiary itself. They mended clothing, cobbled shoes, repaired tools, or assisted in the kitchens. Some tended the infirm, carrying water and tending fires in the sick wards. The division of labor was strict, based on behavior, skill, and the ever-watchful eyes of the jailers. Punishment was woven into daily routine. Infractions, talking back, attempting escape, theft even among convicts, were met with severity. Solitary confinement, flogging, reduced rations. All were instruments of control. Imagine the silence of the solitary cells once again, or the crack of a lash in the exercise yard, its sound echoing off stone and into memory. To live in the penitentiary was to live under constant awareness of consequence. And yet, amid the severity, there were moments of routine that offered something close to normality. Sunday worship gathered men together in the chapel. Hymns rose, sometimes ragged, sometimes powerful. A chorus of voices momentarily united. Chaplains preached of redemption, of forgiveness, of a life beyond these walls. Whether those words comforted or tormented depended on the listener. Evenings descended early, especially in the winter months. The southern sky, vast and clear, darkened over the city, and convicts were returned to their cells, doors shut, bolts drawn, voices dimmed into murmurs, and then silence. In those hours, a man was left with his thoughts, memories of home perhaps, or dreams of freedom that the sea beyond Hobart's harbour made almost impossible. It is important to pause here and consider the psychological atmosphere of such a life. Days were predictable, but that predictability was not soothing. It was confining, a repetition that pressed upon the mind. Work, meager food, strict silence, punishment, rest, and then the cycle again. Time itself became heavy. Weeks blended into months, months into years. For some, this rhythm bred despair. For others, it brought a strange resilience. Human beings, even under the harshest conditions, adapt. A convict might learn to carve small items of wood, to mark days with quiet notches, to find solace in the briefest moments of camaraderie. Even within stone walls, the human spirit sought ways to endure. From the outside, Hobart's free citizens saw the penitentiary as a place of justice, a necessary structure to maintain order in a penal colony. Yet to those within, it was a world unto itself, with rules, hierarchies, fears, and rituals. The penitentiary was not simply a building, it was a machine of daily life, turning every hour into discipline. Let us pause once more. Imagine the end of a day, the faint glow of lanterns in the corridors, the muffled cough of a man in the next cell, the chill of stone beneath fingertips. Above, the stars of the southern sky stretch unbroken, a reminder that beyond walls and locks, there is a world vast and uncontainable. But for those inside, that world remained only a dream. To understand the Hobart Penitentiary, we must pause and look not only at the stone, but at the lives contained within it. A prison, after all, is not merely a structure. It is a vessel filled with stories. Each convict who entered its gates brought with him or her a past, a crime, a journey across oceans, and a future uncertain. Most of the convicts sent to Van Diemen's Land were men. Their crimes ranged widely. Some had committed acts of violence, robbery, assault, even murder. But a great many were sentenced for much smaller offenses: theft of food, pickpocketing, breaking into warehouses. In Britain and Ireland during the early 19th century, poverty was widespread, and the line between survival and crime was thin. To steal a loaf of bread could mean a sentence of 7 years' transportation. To forge a coin or to steal cloth could mean exile to the farthest reaches of the empire. Among these men were also skilled artisans, carpenters, stonemasons, blacksmiths, whose trades were desperately needed in the young colony. Their punishment became the foundation of Hobart's growth. They built not only their own prisons, but also the city itself, its elegant Georgian houses, its warehouses by the waterfront, its bridges arching across streams. Their hands left a legacy, even as their names were forgotten. Women, too, were transported, though in smaller numbers. Many were housed at the Cascades Female Factory, a separate institution, yet some passed through the penitentiary's courtrooms. Their stories reveal lives shaped by hardship, desperation, and often cruelty. For women, crimes of survival, stealing clothing, food, or household goods, were common. Their punishments were as harsh as the men's, and their journeys no less long. Children were not absent either. Some were transported alongside parents, others sentenced on their own. Imagine the sight of a boy no older than 12 entering the penitentiary's gates, the enormity of the place towering above him, the echo of locks and keys marking the beginning of years that should have been filled with school and play. Such children remind us that the penal system was not only about justice, but also about the broader struggles of society, poverty, inequality, and survival. The penitentiary gathered all of these lives and pressed them into its routine. But within those walls, convicts created their own hierarchies and cultures. Some were hardened and defiant, resisting authority in small acts of rebellion. Others kept quiet, enduring their sentences with a kind of stoic patience. Friendships were formed, stories shared, and songs sung quietly when guards could not hear. Even in confinement, humanity asserted itself. Yet there were also those who broke under the strain. Solitary cells, harsh punishments, and endless labor weighed heavily on fragile minds. Records tell of men who fell into despair, who harmed themselves, or who simply faded into silence. The penitentiary was not just a physical prison, but a psychological one. From time to time, the outside world pierced the walls. Trials brought men before judges and juries. Sentences of transportation within Tasmania or to harsher stations like Port Arthur awaited some. Families came to visit, though such visits were rare and heavily supervised. Letters, when allowed, carried fragments of life from across the seas, news of home, of loved ones lost, of a world that seemed more dream than memory. It is important to remember, too, that not all convicts remain convicts forever. Many served their sentences, earned a conditional or absolute pardon, and became free settlers. Some married, raised families, and built new lives in Tasmania. The colony's society was, in many ways, built from this transformation. Criminals turned citizens, punishment turned into labor that seeded permanence. The Hobart Penitentiary, then, was not only a place of confinement, it was a crucible, shaping lives through suffering, but also through resilience. The people within its walls were not faceless numbers, but men, women, and children whose destinies became entwined with Tasmania's history. Pause with me here. Imagine standing in one of the penitentiary's yards as the convicts assemble for roll call. Rows of men in coarse uniforms, faces lined with hardship, eyes carrying both defiance and weariness. Each one is a story. Each one is a life, carried across oceans and bound within walls of stone. The Hobart Penitentiary was never just a place of confinement. It was also a theater of law. Within its walls, justice was performed, sometimes with solemn dignity, sometimes with cruelty, and always under the weight of empire. In the 1850s, as Hobart matured into a colonial capital of substance, the penitentiary's eastern end was transformed. What had once been part of the great convict chapel was refitted into courtroom. Here, judges presided in black robes, juries deliberated, Witnesses testified, and sentences were pronounced. The very space where sermons had once rung with words of forgiveness now echoed with legal arguments and verdicts. Faith and law shared the same roof, each claiming authority over the human soul. Step with me, in imagination, into one of those courtrooms. The sandstone walls rise around you, their surfaces plain but solid. A high ceiling allows voices to carry, and the smell of polished wood lingers faintly. At the front, a judge's bench looms, raised above the floor, so that the law, quite literally, looks down upon the accused. To one side, a dock confines the prisoner, narrow and inescapable. Spectators fill benches at the rear, murmuring in anticipation of proceedings. Cases varied widely. Some men stood accused of theft or assault committed within Hobart itself. Others faced charges for mutiny, escape attempts, or crimes committed while still under sentence. The law extended to all corners of the colony, from remote farms to whaling stations, from town brawls to acts of resistance against authority. Here, within these walls, those conflicts were judged. The process was formal, modelled on English law, but adapted to the colony's realities. Juries were drawn from free settlers, merchants, farmers, shopkeepers, whose perspectives were shaped by their own struggles to carve lives in a challenging land. For convicts, this often meant judgment by those who saw them less as individuals and more as a class, men defined by their crimes rather than their humanity. Sentences were severe. A petty theft might bring months of hard labor. Assault could lead to years of imprisonment or transfer to harsher penal stations such as Port Arthur, where isolation and discipline were unrelenting. Capital crimes, murder, violent robbery could end at the gallows. The penitentiary's own yards, grimly, held execution sites. There, beneath the southern sky, men faced their final moments while crowds gathered in silence, some out of duty, some out of grim curiosity. Yet justice was not always straightforward. Colonial courts were spaces of tension between authority and mercy. Some judges were stern, others surprisingly lenient. Some juries hesitated to convict when evidence was thin, while others returned swift and decisive verdicts. In these variations, one sees the humanity of the legal system, shaped not only by law, but also by circumstance, prejudice, and compassion. For the convicts, the courtroom was a place of uncertainty. A man might enter hoping for pardon and leave condemned to the gallows. Another might fear the worst and find himself given only a few months more of confinement. The emotional weight of these proceedings cannot be overstated. Lives turned upon the words spoken beneath the high ceiling of those rooms. But justice in Van Diemen's Land was not confined to convicts alone. Free settlers, too, stood trial within the penitentiary's courtrooms. Disputes over land, accusations of theft, even charges of violence between neighbors, all found their way here. Thus, the building became not only a convict institution, but a civic one. The law, in its colonial form, was administered to all, binding the society together in a shared framework of rules and consequences. There is a strange irony in this dual role. A place meant to discipline convicts also became the site where free citizens sought justice. A structure of punishment transformed into a symbol of order. For Hobart, the penitentiary's courtrooms were a center of civic life, as much as they were a mechanism of control. Let us linger for a moment in one of those trials. Imagine the silence as a verdict is delivered, the words hanging in the air like stones. A man lowers his head, the gavel strikes wood. Outside, the life of the city goes on. ships unloading at the docks, children playing in narrow streets, merchants calling their wares, while inside, one life has changed forever. The courtrooms remind us that the penitentiary was more than walls and cells. It was a nexus of authority, spiritual, judicial, and social. Within its stone perimeter, questions of right and wrong, guilt and innocence, punishment and mercy were played out, shaping the destiny not only of individuals, but of the colony itself. The Hobart Penitentiary was a place built on paradox. It was meant to punish, to deter, and to control. Yet it was also, in the ideals of its designers and reformers, meant to reform, to discipline into virtue, and to offer the possibility of redemption. Between these two purposes, punishment and reform, lay a tension that shaped every cell, every routine, every human life within its walls. In the early 19th century, British penal philosophy was evolving. For centuries, punishment had been public, brutal, and immediate. Whippings, hangings, and brandings in town squares, spectacles meant to warn as much as to discipline. But by the time the penitentiary was constructed, a new idea had taken root, that punishment might be more effective if it was hidden behind walls, if it worked upon the mind as much as the body. Thus, prisons became laboratories of reform as much as they were instruments of pain. Still, the Hobart Penitentiary never abandoned severity. Infractions were dealt with swiftly. The lash remained a feared instrument. In the exercise yards, men were flogged in front of others, each strike a lesson written into flesh. Solitary confinement, too, was widely employed. Men were placed in small, windowless cells, given meager rations, and left to the silence of their own thoughts. Reformers argued that solitude would prompt reflection and penitence. In truth, for many, it brought despair, confusion, and madness. Work itself was a form of punishment. Long hours of labor, whether on roads, quarries, or public works, tested bodies and minds alike. Chains were often employed, clinking reminders of bondage. Yet labor was also seen as a pathway to order. Through discipline of the body, it was believed the mind might be corrected. A man who once stole bread might, through years of toil, be remade into a citizen of industry. There were, too, punishments less visible, but no less real. Reduced rations, loss of small privileges, denial of correspondence or visits, these were quiet tools of control, shaping behavior through deprivation. The penitentiary was a place where power was exercised in countless ways, large and small, physical and psychological. And yet, amid this severity, the idea of reform was never absent. Chaplains preached of repentance. Schooling was sometimes offered, teaching men to read and write. Those who showed good behavior might earn tickets of leave, gradual steps toward freedom. In this balance, the penitentiary mirrored the broader shifts of the 19th century. The search for a justice system that could punish crime without abandoning the possibility of redemption. Executions, however, stood as the starkest reminder of finality. Within the penitentiary grounds, gallows were erected, and men condemned in the courtrooms sometimes ended their lives only a short walk from where they were judged. The ritual was grim, carried out with solemn procedure. For some, it was the ultimate deterrent. For others, it was evidence of a justice system still steeped in the ancient language of death. To imagine punishment here is to imagine not only pain, but atmosphere. The air heavy with anticipation before a flogging. The silence of a corridor outside solitary cells the dim light of a chapel sermon, urging repentance to men who knew they faced years more behind stone. Punishment was not merely physical, it was architectural, emotional, spiritual. The very design of the penitentiary sought to press upon its inmates a sense of order, inevitability, and authority. Today, as we reflect from the calm of history, it is tempting to judge these punishments as cruel, and indeed, by modern standards they were. Yet within their own era, they were seen as progressive, even humane, compared to the public tortures of earlier centuries. The penitentiary stands as a reminder that justice is always a mirror of its time. What one age sees as discipline, another may see as cruelty. Pause here. Imagine a man seated in his solitary cell, scratching a prayer into the stone with a fragment of nail, or another bowing his head in the chapel, listening to a chaplain's voice rise toward the rafters. Punishment and reform, despair and hope. These contradictions lived side by side within Hobart Penitentiary, and they shaped every heartbeat within its walls. No prison, however strong its walls, can entirely extinguish the dream of freedom. Inside the Hobart Penitentiary, where routine and punishment pressed down upon every hour, the idea of escape was a flicker that never quite vanished. For some, it was an idle fantasy whispered in the dark of a cell. For others, it became a desperate plan carried out with cunning and courage, however slim the chances of success. The geography of Tasmania itself shaped these dreams. The penitentiary stood in the heart of Hobart, its walls a clear barrier, but beyond them lay a city under constant watch. Soldiers patrolled the streets, constables moved among taverns and docks, and settlers were wary of offering shelter to fugitives. Beyond the city stretched forests, mountains, and rivers, a wilderness both beautiful and unforgiving. Unlike mainland Australia, where vast open plains allowed longer escapes, Van Diemen's Land was an island. The sea was always there, hemming fugitives in, a final barrier to liberty. Yet still they tried. Records speak of men who scaled walls under cover of night, or who slipped away while working on road gangs outside the penitentiary. Some disguised themselves as free settlers, sewing together stolen garments or painting their faces with soot to alter their appearance. Others sought passage on ships, bribing sailors or hiding in cargo holds. Few succeeded for long. Hunger, exposure, and the vigilance of authorities ensured most were quickly captured. Punishments for recapture were severe. Floggings, irons, or transfer to Port Arthur, where escape was considered nearly impossible. Yet the persistence of attempts tells us something vital, that even under the weight of confinement, the human spirit strains toward freedom. There were also acts of resistance less dramatic than escape. Convicts carved graffiti into stone walls, inscriptions that still survive as faint marks of identity, initials, symbols, crude drawings. Others whispered songs or passed stories that mocked authority, small rebellions carried in memory and voice. Some feigned illness to avoid labor, or stole small items to barter within the prison's underground economy. And then there were collective moments. On rare occasions, tensions boiled into protests or mutinies, quickly suppressed by guards but never entirely absent from memory. The penitentiary, like any institution of control, was never completely stable. Beneath its routines lay currents of resistance, subtle or overt. Consider for a moment the psychology of these attempts. To plan an escape was to imagine a future, however unlikely. To carve one's name into a wall was to declare existence in a place designed to erase individuality. To sing a forbidden song was to claim a fragment of dignity. In these small acts, convicts resisted not only their captors, but also the crushing anonymity of imprisonment. One can almost hear the whispers of such defiance, the quiet scratch of stone against stone as a mark is carved, the low hum of a tune carried through corridors, the hurried footsteps of a man risking everything as he runs into the night. These sounds, though faint, remind us that the penitentiary was not a place of absolute silence. It was alive with tension, with hope, with human will refusing to be entirely subdued. And though most who sought escape were caught, the stories of their attempts endure. They lend a strange vitality to the penitentiary's history, proof that even in the most controlled of spaces, freedom remained a dream too powerful to be extinguished. Pause here. Picture the penitentiary at night, lanterns glowing along the walls, guards pacing with rifles in hand, and somewhere in the dark, a prisoner pressing his ear to the silence, wondering if tonight might be the night he makes his move. The dream of escape, fragile, often doomed, was nevertheless part of the heartbeat of this place. Amidst the stone and iron of the Hobart Penitentiary, one structure stood out, not for its severity, but for its solemnity, the chapel. It was not a place of punishment, nor of labor, nor of confinement. Instead, it was conceived as a space for redemption, a house of worship, where voices rose toward heaven, even as walls closed in around men below. Religion was central to the penal system of the 19th century. The authorities of Van Diemen's Land believed that crime was not merely a matter of law, but of morality and soul. A convict was not only a lawbreaker, but also a sinner, and if he could be reformed, it would be as much through spiritual awakening as through physical discipline. The chapel was, therefore, at the very heart of this philosophy. Inside, the architecture reflected this purpose. The chapel was designed to accommodate large numbers of convicts, yet in such a way that they could be watched, controlled, and separated. The pews were narrow and ordered, ensuring discipline even in worship. The pulpit stood elevated, a reminder of the moral authority that presided over their lives. Sunlight, filtering through high windows, softened the harsh stone, and in those moments, the penitentiary seemed less like a fortress and more like a cloister. The sermons delivered here were earnest, sometimes fiery. Chaplains spoke of sin and repentance, of the promise of forgiveness. They read from Scripture, reminding men that salvation was possible even for the condemned. For some convicts, these words offered comfort. The thought of redemption, of another chance in the eyes of God, brought solace to hearts otherwise hardened by labor and punishment. For others, the words were hollow, an echo of a morality that had long abandoned them. Yet whether embraced or resisted, the sermons filled the chapel with a gravity that lingered. Music, too, played its part. Hymns were sung, their melodies carried by voices roughened by toil and time. Imagine the sound of 100 men singing together, their voices rising in imperfect harmony, filling the air above stone walls with strains of hope. Even those who doubted might have felt, for a moment, that they belonged to something larger than themselves. Faith in the penitentiary was not only collective, but deeply personal. Some men turned inward, whispering prayers in their cells, carving crosses into the timber of their bunks, or clutching scraps of paper with psalms written upon them. Others sought confession, unburdening themselves to chaplains in quiet corners. A few even found vocation, emerging from their years of confinement with genuine religious devotion. It is important to note that religion here was also a tool of authority. Faith was encouraged not only for the salvation of souls, but also for the maintenance of order. A man who believed in divine judgment might be more compliant with earthly rules. A convict who accepted his punishment as penance might labor more obediently. The chapel, then, was both sanctuary and instrument, a place of solace and also of subtle control. Yet beyond its use as discipline, there were moments of genuine transformation. Chaplains recorded instances of men who wept openly during sermons, who begged forgiveness, who sought new lives when freedom finally came. For them, the chapel had not been an imposition, but a lifeline. Today, as one steps into the old penitentiary chapel, there is still a hush, a sense of presence. The wooden pews creak softly underfoot, the pulpit looms with quiet dignity, and the walls seem to hold echoes of voices, some repentant, some doubtful, some hopeful. It is a reminder that faith, whether accepted or resisted, was a central thread in the fabric of the penitentiary's life. Pause here. Imagine yourself sitting among the convicts, the air heavy with dust and candle smoke, a chaplain's voice rising in solemn rhythm, while outside, guards pace the yard. For an hour, perhaps, punishment gave way to reflection, and in the chapel's quiet embrace, the human spirit sought something beyond stone and chains. If one were to step back in time and enter the Hobart Penitentiary on an ordinary day, the first impression would not be of drama or violence, but of rhythm, an unyielding pattern that shaped every waking hour. Life here was a system of bells, footsteps, and commands, designed to strip away disorder and impose a strict routine upon men whose lives had once strayed outside the boundaries of law. The day began early. At dawn, guards moved along the corridors, their boots echoing against stone as heavy keys turned in iron locks. Doors creaked open, and convicts stirred from rough wooden bunks. The cells were small, sparsely furnished. A bed, a bucket, sometimes a shelf for meager belongings. The first light of morning seeped through barred windows, pale and cold. Men rose in silence, their movements already practiced by habit. Breakfast was simple, served in rations carefully measured. Bread, sometimes porridge, occasionally salted meat. There was little variety, and often the portions were small enough that hunger remained a constant companion. Yet these meals sustained men through long hours of labor. In the hushed eating halls, the clatter of tin bowls was one of the few sounds allowed. Conversation was often forbidden or kept to whispers. After breakfast, labor began. The nature of work varied. Some convicts were sent beyond the penitentiary walls to road gangs, where they broke stones, cleared forests, or constructed the infrastructure of the young colony. Others remained inside, employed in workshops, shoemaking, carpentry, or smithing. Labor was both punishment and necessity. It disciplined bodies while fueling the growth of Hobart itself. For those in solitary confinement, the routine was different. Locked in their cells, they endured hours of silence, with only brief intervals for exercise in narrow yards. Here, time stretched, the absence of labor replaced by the burden of one's own thoughts. The system believed that solitude would inspire reflection, yet for many, it led instead to despair. Midday brought another meal, again plain, again rationed. Then work resumed, the clink of irons, the scraping of tools, the distant thud of hammers, shaping the soundtrack of the afternoon. Guards moved constantly, ensuring order, their presence a reminder that even the smallest act of disobedience could bring swift punishment. When evening arrived, convicts returned to their cells. Supper was meager, often little more than bread and water. Darkness fell early, and with it, silence once more. By nightfall, the penitentiary was hushed, save for the occasional cough, the mutter of a restless sleeper, or the far-off call of guards patrolling the yard. And yet, within this rigid order, small moments of humanity survived. A man might carve his initials into a hidden corner of wood. Another might whisper a story to the prisoner beside him when guards passed by. On rare occasions, laughter erupted, quickly silenced, but lingering in memory. Even in the narrow space between punishment and reform, men sought connection, identity, and fragments of normal life. To imagine a day here is to feel both monotony and weight. Time did not pass in dramatic events, but in steady repetition. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years. For some, release eventually came. For others, the penitentiary was the boundary of their existence, their lives beginning and ending within these walls. And yet, in this monotony lies the essence of the penitentiary's history. It was not only the site of floggings, escapes, or executions. It was also the place of endless days, each one shaped by routine, each one carrying the quiet endurance of hundreds of men. Pause here. Picture the long shadows of evening settling over the yards, convicts retreating to their cells, the hum of the city faint beyond the walls. Inside, silence deepens, but the weight of countless days remains, etched into the very stones. For every convict within the Hobart Penitentiary, there was also a keeper, a guard, a warden, or a member of staff who stood on the other side of authority. Though often overlooked in the broader narrative of convict history, these figures played a crucial role in shaping the atmosphere of the prison. Their lives, too, were bound by its walls, their routines dictated by duty, their own freedoms circumscribed by the very system they enforced. The guards were not men of privilege. Many were drawn from the ranks of soldiers who had once served in the British Army. Some were veterans of distant campaigns, their lives marked by scars of battle. Others were men who sought employment in the colony and found in the penitentiary a steady, if difficult, livelihood. They carried rifles, truncheons, and the authority of the law, yet their daily existence was as repetitive as that of the prisoners they oversaw. At dawn, they patrolled corridors, unlocking cells, counting heads. Throughout the day, they watched over labor gangs, ensuring no tools became weapons, no man slipped away into the shadows. They broke up quarrels, enforced silence, and delivered punishments. By night, they paced the walls, their lanterns flickering against stone, their ears alert for the sound of movement in the dark. Yet their role was not only one of discipline. Guards lived in constant tension between vigilance and compassion. Some enforced rules with severity, believing that fear was the only language convicts understood. Others, perhaps weary of cruelty, allowed small mercies, a whispered word, a lenient glance, a moment of shared humanity. Stories linger of guards who looked the other way at minor transgressions, who recognized the fragility beneath hardened exteriors. Beyond the guards, there were wardens and administrators. These men bore the responsibility of order on a larger scale, organizing rations, recording punishments, maintaining correspondence with colonial officials. Their work was bureaucratic, yet heavy with consequence. A misplaced entry in a ledger might delay a ticket of leave. A harsh recommendation could mean years more of confinement. Authority here was not abstract, but lived out in paperwork and decisions that shaped human futures. Chaplains, too, belonged to this community of keepers. They stood apart from the soldiers and wardens, their role less about control and more about guidance. Yet they too were bound to the system. Their sermons, their counsel, their prayers, all formed part of the machinery of reform and discipline. For the families of guards and staff, life carried its own burdens. Many lived near the penitentiary, their homes overshadowed by its walls. Wives heard the distant echoes of chains and shouts. Children grew up under the watchful gaze of soldiers, their games played within earshot of barred windows. The line between the world of the free and the world of the confined was thinner here than anywhere else in Hobart. It is easy to imagine the strain this life carried. Guards walked a narrow path between duty and danger, between compassion and control. At times they faced hostility, even violence, from the men they watched. At other times, they wrestled with their own conscience, questioning whether justice and mercy could ever coexist in such a place. To see the penitentiary only as a monument to convict suffering is to miss this other side of the story. It was also a place where ordinary men labored in uniforms, where families lived in its shadow, where authority was both a burden and a necessity. The keepers of order, though not imprisoned, were nevertheless shaped by the penitentiary's rhythms. Their identities, their memories, their very lives were entwined with the fate of this institution. Pause here. Imagine the lantern of a guard swaying as he walks the night watch, the scrape of his boots steady against stone. Behind each cell door, silence. Beyond the walls, the city sleeps. And in that solitary circle of light, one man bears the responsibility of holding the fragile line between order and chaos. To understand the Hobart Penitentiary, we must look beyond its walls of stone and iron and into the lives of those who filled its cells. Statistics and architecture give shape to history, but it is the human stories, the faces, the voices, the fragments of memory that lend the penitentiary its most enduring weight. The men who arrived here came from many walks of life, yet all shared the common thread of displacement. Most were transported from Britain or Ireland, swept across oceans by sentences that carried them far from their homes. Their crimes were often small by modern standards: theft of bread, poaching on an aristocrat's land, or stealing cloth from a shop. Poverty and desperation had been their constant companions long before they encountered the machinery of justice. Others bore heavier charges: assault, forgery, desertion, even murder. For them, the penitentiary was one station in a longer journey through the penal system. Some had already endured the horrors of Norfolk Island or Port Arthur before arriving in Hobart. Others would be sent there after committing further offences. Take, for instance, the young Irish labourer caught stealing food for a family during a famine. Transported thousands of miles, he found himself in Hobart, pressed into labour on roads he would never travel freely. Or the London pickpocket, nimble-fingered and quick, whose talents, once a means of survival, brought him years behind stone walls. There were sailors who deserted their ships, soldiers who disobeyed orders, women whose sentences brought them to separate institutions, but who occasionally crossed paths with Hobart's men during labour assignments. Some prisoners left behind writings, letters, petitions, scraps of diary entries that allow us to glimpse their inner worlds. In these words, we hear longing for distant families, anger at injustice, pleas for forgiveness. Others left marks more tangible, but no less haunting. Initials carved into timber, drawings scratched into plaster, names etched into stone. These traces remind us that every convict carried an identity, a history that resisted erasure. There were also men who defied the stereotypes. Not all were hardened criminals. Some were educated, their offences the result of misfortune rather than malice. A school teacher convicted of forgery might find himself teaching fellow inmates to read. A clerk who falsified records might now keep ledgers for prison officials. In these cases, skills once misused found unexpected purpose behind the penitentiary's walls. But even in these stories of adaptation, there was an undercurrent of loss. Letters home were rare and often censored. Many convicts never saw their families again. Children grew up without fathers, wives without husbands, parents without sons. The distance was not only physical, but emotional. The colony became a severance from everything familiar, and the penitentiary deepened that separation. Some found ways to endure. They built friendships, however fragile. They shared songs from their homelands, whispered jokes, and memories of better days. Others found solace in faith, clutching at chaplain's words as lifelines. A few earned early release through good behaviour, stepping out into Hobart with the chance to rebuild lives in a strange but growing colony. Yet for many, the penitentiary was their final home. Illness, exhaustion, and despair claimed lives within its walls. Burials in nearby cemeteries became the quiet conclusion to stories that had begun far away. In this, the penitentiary was not only a place of confinement, but a place of endings. Pause here. Imagine standing in a narrow cell, running your hand along the cool stone, tracing faint initials carved by someone long gone. Behind those letters lies a whole life, a childhood, a family, a crime, a voyage, and the slow passing of years in this place. The penitentiary may appear as stone and shadow, but in truth, it was a mosaic of lives, ordinary, flawed, and profoundly human. The Hobart Penitentiary was never an isolated fortress, though its thick walls gave that impression. It was woven into the life of Hobart itself, its presence felt in the rhythms of the streets, the labour of its prisoners, and the imaginations of those who live beyond its gates. From the moment of its construction, the penitentiary was a landmark. Its sandstone walls rose from the northern edge of the young settlement, visible to sailors arriving in the harbour and to townsfolk going about their daily errands. To some, it was a symbol of order and authority, proof that the colony maintained discipline. To others, it was a reminder of the darker undercurrent of colonial life, where convicts were both builders and captives. The labour of the men confined here was felt throughout Hobart. Roads were paved, docks constructed, buildings erected, all by hands that returned each evening to cells of confinement. The very fabric of the city was shaped by convict labour, and in this way, the penitentiary reached into every corner of urban life. Even those who never set foot inside its gates walked streets built by those who did. Economically, the penitentiary was a hub of activity. Goods produced within, shoes, furniture, metalwork, entered the colony's circulation, their origins hidden but essential. For free settlers, the presence of convict labour was both boon and burden. It provided cheap labour for infrastructure, yet it also reinforced the colony's reputation as a penal settlement, a place marked by stigma in the wider world. Socially, the penitentiary was both feared and familiar. Townsfolk heard the bells that marked its routines, saw the chain gangs marching through the streets, and whispered stories of escapes or punishments. For children, it was a place of fascination and dread, its walls looming in their games of imagination. For families of convicts, it was a site of sorrow, a boundary that separated them from loved ones. For others, it was simply part of the backdrop of life, as ordinary in its presence as the harbour or the hills. The relationship between the penitentiary and the city was not only practical, but symbolic. It embodied the paradox of Hobart itself, a community striving toward respectability, prosperity, and culture, yet built upon foundations of punishment and exile. As the colony grew, so too did efforts to distance Hobart from its penal origins. Theatres opened, churches expanded, schools were established, all signs of civility that coexisted uneasily with the grim silhouette of the penitentiary. Even after transportation ended and convict numbers dwindled, the penitentiary's influence lingered. Its buildings were repurposed, its cells adapted for new uses, yet its identity remained etched into the memory of the city. The sandstone walls became not only relics of punishment, but also monuments to resilience, of a community that had grown from penal colony to proud settlement, and of individuals who had endured within its confines. To stand today in Hobart, with Mount Wellington rising in the distance and the Derwent shimmering in the light, is to see a city transformed. Yet the penitentiary remains, a reminder that beneath the beauty and calm lies a deeper story, one in which every street corner and sandstone building carries echoes of convict footsteps. Pause here. Imagine walking through Hobart 2 centuries ago, hearing the clink of irons on stone, watching convicts labour as townsfolk hurry past. The penitentiary was not hidden, it was in plain sight, shaping the city's life, its economy, and its identity. And in this shared space, both free and confined lives intersected, creating the layered history that still lingers in the air. No institution remains unchanged forever. The Hobart Penitentiary, so deeply bound to the early decades of Tasmania's convict history, inevitably found itself reshaped by the shifting tides of law, society, and morality. As the 19th century wore on, the very foundations of its purpose began to erode, until what had once been a central pillar of colonial order became an aging relic of another era. The first great change came with the gradual end of transportation. By the mid-1800s, Britain's practice of sending convicts to Australia had become increasingly controversial. Public sentiment in the colonies shifted strongly against it. Free settlers, eager to build a society free of penal stigma, grew resentful of being tethered to the reputation of the prison island. Campaigns and petitions multiplied, and by 1853, transportation to Van Diemen's Land officially ceased. This decision struck at the heart of the penitentiary. Built primarily to house transported convicts, it suddenly faced a future without the constant influx of men from Britain. Yet prisons were still needed, and so the institution adapted. The penitentiary evolved into a colonial jail, housing not only former convicts, but also local offenders, thieves, debtors, the destitute who ran afoul of law, and those awaiting trial or execution. Its role shifted from imperial outpost to local necessity, serving Tasmania's own population rather than Britain's castaways. Architecture mirrored this transformation. Cells were altered, new divisions created, and the courthouse integrated into its design gained greater importance as trials were conducted within its walls. The gallows, too, became a somber fixture, where executions carried out in Hobart reminded the public that justice, though hidden behind stone, remained a force of finality. By the late 19th century, however, the penitentiary was already aging. Its sandstone walls, once symbols of authority, now bore the marks of time. Cracks spread through masonry, roofs leaked, and narrow corridors felt increasingly outdated in light of modern penal philosophies. Across the world, reformers spoke of rehabilitation, education, and humane treatment. Tasmania, too, began to reconsider what a prison should be. The old penitentiary, with its cramped cells and grim yards, seemed less like a place of reform and more like a relic of severity. Gradually, functions were stripped away. Some sections fell into disuse, others were repurposed. The courthouse remained active, but the prison population was redistributed to newer facilities better suited to contemporary ideas of order and discipline. By the early 20th century, the penitentiary had lost much of its original role, its echoing corridors now more memory than necessity. Yet decline does not mean disappearance. Even as its official functions dwindled, the penitentiary persisted as a physical presence, its walls refusing to vanish from the cityscape. The people of Hobart walked past it daily, its stones quietly reminding them of the convict past they were both reluctant to acknowledge and unable to forget. Pause here. Imagine the penitentiary in those years of decline. Weeds pushing through cracks in the yard, rooms once filled with labor now gathering dust, the voices of authority quieter, the weight of history heavier. No longer a site of constant movement and control, it became instead a shell, an architectural memory standing amidst a city that was steadily looking forward. As the 20th century unfolded, Hobart Penitentiary shifted further from function into memory. The walls remained, but their role in daily justice diminished until they stood not as an instrument of control, but as a relic of another age. And in that slow transformation, the penitentiary became something new, not a prison, but a vessel of heritage. At first, the process was uncertain. Old jails often met the wrecking ball, their associations with suffering and crime deemed unsuitable for modern cities. Yet in Hobart, the sandstone buildings endured. Some sections fell into ruin, their roofs sagging, their interiors weathered by years of neglect. Others found temporary uses, offices, storage, even court functions that lingered long after the prisoners had gone. But beneath every adaptation lay the unmistakable bones of a convict past. By the mid-20th century, a new way of thinking emerged. Across Australia, historians and citizens began to re-evaluate the convict legacy. Where once it had been a source of shame, increasingly it was seen as a foundation of identity. Tasmania, in particular, recognized that its most distinctive history lay in its penal past, a story that could not be erased without also erasing the origins of its cities and communities. In this climate, the Hobart Penitentiary was preserved. Conservation efforts stabilized its walls, repaired collapsing sections, and restored spaces so they could be safely visited. The chapel, long a place of spiritual guidance, became a centerpiece of heritage tours. The courtrooms were reopened as windows into colonial justice, where visitors could sit where convicts once stood trial. Even the gallows, grim though they were, became part of the story told to those who wished to understand the fullness of history. Today, walking through the penitentiary is not an experience of punishment, but of reflection. Guides lead visitors through echoing corridors, their voices soft against the stone. Stories are told of the men who once labored, who once dreamed of freedom, who once carved their initials into timber. Light falls through old windows, illuminating the textures of sandstone that have absorbed centuries of lives. The atmosphere is not theatrical, but contemplative. Here, history is not dramatized, but allowed to speak for itself. Each cell, each yard, each worn stair tells its own quiet tale. Visitors pause, sensing both the weight of suffering and the resilience of those who endured. It is a place where the past is not erased nor glorified, but acknowledged with honesty. Preservation is not only about buildings, it is about memory. By keeping the penitentiary standing, Hobart has chosen to remember rather than forget. It has chosen to embrace the complexity of its convict legacy, not as a stain, but as a chapter of identity. In doing so, it offers both locals and travelers a chance to walk through time, to hear echoes of footsteps long faded, and to understand how deeply this place shaped the city that grew around it. Pause here. Imagine yourself standing in the chapel today, the pews empty, the air still. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you can almost hear the murmur of hymns, the scrape of boots, the whisper of prayers. Then you open them again, and all is quiet. The penitentiary lives now, not as prison, but as memory, a bridge between the pain of the past and the reflections of the present. Every building holds more than stone and timber. It carries the weight of human experience. The Hobart Penitentiary, through its transformations, stands today as one of Tasmania's most eloquent storytellers. It does not speak in words, but in silence, in shadows, in the way its walls seem to lean inward with memory. To walk its corridors is to engage with a paradox. On one hand, it is a site of pain, of confinement, punishment, and the struggles of countless men whose lives were diminished by the harshness of the system. On the other hand, it is a testament to endurance, a reminder that even within systems of severity, human resilience found expression. Scratched initials, fragments of songs once sung in yards, whispered prayers. These are the small but persistent traces of life that resisted erasure. The penitentiary also invites reflection on the broader story of Tasmania itself. For many decades, the island's identity was framed by its penal origins, often uncomfortably. The term Van Diemen's Land carried a chill, conjuring images of transportation and exile, but time has softened that view. Today, Tasmania embraces this past, not as shame, but as inheritance. The penitentiary is part of a larger network of convict sites across the island, all recognized for their global significance. Together, they speak to the shared history of empire, migration, and the shaping of societies through both hardship and hope. The story of Hobart Penitentiary is also a mirror of human justice. What was once considered acceptable, the solitary cell, the gallows, the grinding labor, now feels unthinkable. This shift reveals not only the cruelty of the past, but the evolution of compassion. By standing in these spaces today, we are reminded that justice, too, is a journey, shaped by cultural values that continue to change. And yet, even with all its severity, the penitentiary offers more than judgment. It offers perspective. It allows us to look back and see how far society has come, to measure progress not just in material terms, but in ethical ones. It asks us to think, how will future generations judge the systems of today? What walls will they preserve, and what stories will they tell of us? There is, within the penitentiary, a quiet reassurance. For while it bears the marks of suffering, it also bears the mark of survival. It stands not as ruin, but as preserved memory, cared for by those who recognize its worth. This, too, is a lesson, that the past cannot be erased, but it can be honored, learned from, and folded gently into the present. Pause here. Imagine dusk falling over Hobart, the penitentiary's sandstone glowing with the last light of day. The city moves around it, cars, footsteps, voices, yet the building remains steady, watching, remembering. In its silence, it does not condemn or glorify. It simply exists, carrying within it the layered story of human lives, of a colony, of a nation finding its identity. And so, our long journey through the Hobart Penitentiary draws toward its close. We have wandered through its sandstone halls, paused in its chapel, traced the echoes of footsteps in its yards, and listened to the whispered stories that still linger within its walls. What began as a place of discipline and fear has become, through the passage of time, a place of memory and reflection. The penitentiary reminds us that history is never abstract. It is always lived by individuals with names, with voices, with hopes that stretched beyond the limits of their confinement. To remember them is to honor the humanity that persisted even when systems sought to suppress it. Their struggles, though often harsh, helped shape the contours of Tasmania's identity, binding the island forever to the larger story of empire and migration. There is a gentle truth in how the penitentiary now stands. Once it imposed order upon unwilling men. Today, it invites curiosity, contemplation, and learning. It asks nothing of us but our attention, and in giving it, we gain not only knowledge of the past, but a deeper awareness of how the present has been shaped. Perhaps, as you reflect on this journey, you feel a sense of stillness. The penitentiary is no longer a place of clanging locks or heavy chains. It is quiet now, offering only the weight of time and the soft murmur of history. To sit with that quiet is to experience a kind of peace, a reminder that even the harshest chapters of human endeavor eventually settle into memory. As night settles over Hobart, imagine the penitentiary at rest, walls cooled by evening air, shadows stretching gently across the courtyard, the chapel's windows faintly glowing in the last light. The city hums beyond its gates, alive and forward-looking, while within the penitentiary, time feels slower, deeper, almost suspended. This is the gift of places like these. They allow us to step outside of ordinary life, to breathe in history at a different rhythm, and to remember that every moment we live is connected to countless others before us. The Hobart Penitentiary, in its endurance, is not only a record of suffering, but a meditation on resilience, transformation, and the enduring presence of memory in stone. And now, as we close this exploration, let us carry with us both knowledge and calm. Knowledge of the stories preserved within these walls, and calm in knowing that history, though it may hold shadows, also brings light. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May you rest tonight with the gentle assurance that the past, though distant, continues to whisper its lessons softly into the present. Beyond the walls of the Hobart Penitentiary lies an island of striking beauty. Tasmania's mountains rise in soft blue silhouettes, its rivers wind gently toward the sea, and its skies hold a light that seems at once gentle and eternal. The natural world here is vast, untamed, and deeply grounding, and within it, human history, sometimes fragile, sometimes heavy, finds its place. The penitentiary is only one thread in Tasmania's tapestry. Scattered across the island are other sites of memory. Port Arthur, with its wide open ruins and stories of discipline and reform. The coal mines historic site, where convicts once labored in the dark, and the many small roadside markers and cemeteries that quietly hold names, long forgotten by the world, but remembered by the land. Together, these places form a network of remembrance, each one telling part of the larger story of how people endured, struggled, and survived. When we visit these places, we are not only looking backward, we are also looking inward. History becomes a mirror, reflecting both what was and what we are becoming. The sandstone of the penitentiary, worn by time, invites us to ask, how do we hold our own pasts? Do we see them as burdens or as teachers? Do we try to erase them, or do we allow them to remind us of how far we have traveled? For Tasmania, embracing the convict's story has been an act of courage. Once, it was a tale hidden in shadows. Today, it is a recognized part of world heritage, valued for its depth, its lessons, and its resonance with human experience everywhere. Every society has its own difficult histories. What matters is how those histories are remembered, whether they are silenced or given space to speak. And so, the Hobart Penitentiary does not stand alone. It is part of a dialogue that stretches across oceans and centuries, linking Tasmania to Britain, to empire, and to all those whose lives were touched by exile and transportation. It is a reminder that history is never isolated. It is always part of a larger web, connecting lands and peoples in ways both painful and profound. As we step back from the penitentiary, as we return to the wider landscape of Tasmania, there is a sense of balance. The walls may hold stories of hardship, but the hills and rivers, the forests and skies offer renewal. Together, they remind us that human history, no matter how heavy, is always set within the embrace of a world that endures beyond us. So tonight, as you close your eyes, perhaps you will carry with you the image of sandstone walls, bathed in soft light, the quiet of the chapel, the cool air of Hobart drifting through narrow windows. Perhaps you will also carry the wider image of Tasmania itself, a place of resilience, of memory, and of gentle, lasting beauty. Here, history and nature meet. And in that meeting, we are offered not only knowledge, but peace.